Welcome back to this last video in this tutorial series. In the following slides, I'll take you through 4 main sections. You can see the roadmap here. First, I cover the 6 major approaches to planning and advancing an investigation. Then we'll look at 4 examples of research studies based on different approaches. Next, I'll diagram the essential parts of an argument. And finally, I'll go through what I call the stages of life of an investigation. This includes sitting down to write. So put your hands in the air and let's get started. Let's look now at the first research approach. In this approach, research questions initially drive the study, and the researcher ultimately arrives at an empirical argument. Here's what this approach typically looks like using the 6 dimensions I introduced in part 4. If you look up here, and 1, an deductive research design. 2, an empirical, a qualitative study. 3, well-defined research questions. 4, methods could include a number of data collection strategies. 5, no formal theoretical framework. And 6, the study ends with an empirical argument. In this approach, the researcher begins with clearly defined research questions that guide the investigation in the field or in their data set. The task is often to identify the factors that appear to be associated with a particular outcome of interest. However, there is no formal theory. That is, no theoretical framework that guides the study. And finally, the study ends with an empirical argument. In other words, the researcher provides their own disciplined interpretation of what their findings appear to reveal. Now, let me add an important caveat. Although this approach is often not driven by formal theory, some researchers may still draw upon broader grand theories to orient their investigation. For example, Marxism, conflict theory, feminist theory, critical race theory. In these cases, the researcher is using a broad theoretical orientation to help frame how they understand social inequality, power, institutions, or social relationships. They are making explicit the broader lens that orient them and guide their study. Let me be very clear. No study is ideologically neutral. No study is entirely value-free. Our values in politics, whether we are conscious of them or not, shape what we choose to study. For example, many scholars are drawn to questions involving social inequality, exclusion, or power. And sometimes studies examine power differences even when those dynamics are left underanalyzed. A useful distinction is this. Research questions are often value-laden, but your analysis of evidence must remain disciplined, rigorous, and transparent. At the same time, research questions can absolutely proceed without formal theory, particularly when scholars are trying to identify important empirical patterns. For example, do female adolescents have larger support networks than male adolescents? In this investigation, the researcher selects a method designed to answer an empirical question. If existing or prior research hasn't provided an answer to this question, the researcher's published study makes a contribution to the field. Another researcher asks, what might be happening? Why do female adolescents have larger support networks than male adolescents? This becomes a new study, this time using a theoretical framework, perhaps a combination of social capital theory and research in anthropology. Now let's move to the second approach. This next approach follows the tradition of grounded theory. My description here will be very brief. The main idea in this methodology is that new theory can emerge in a process of an iteration between data collection, analysis, and emerging themes. Emergent design, or the use of multiple methods of data collection, is usually part of the research process. Following our multiple dimensions framework, we can say there is a gradual emergence of a theoretical framework during analysis and ending with a theoretical argument. I accentuate 2 dimensions here. 5. The gradual emergence of a theoretical framework during analysis. 6. The study ends with a theoretical argument. Let me also briefly note an important point. Another important point. There is an ongoing debate in the field about whether grounded theory can truly produce entirely new theory through a purely inductive process. I simply want you to be aware that this debate exists, and I encourage you to explore it through your own reading. The third approach involves investigating and identifying an underlying causal mechanism between variables, which involves using an appropriate theoretical framework to guide the study. In this approach, researchers are deeply concerned with the how and the why behind the relationships between variables. They're not simply asking whether X is related to Y. They want to understand the mechanism connecting them. So if X appears to have an effect on Y, what is the mechanism that causes X to have an effect on Y? Let me emphasize that the theory or theories used are to guide, somewhat like a flashlight in the dark. The flashlight is not dictating where you should go or where you should turn. Rather, it's helping you decide which way you should turn. Let's look at an easy and fast example. We all know about the concern regarding how climate change and global warming are disrupting the natural, economic, and social systems we all depend on. The factors that are believed to contribute to global warming? Well, the burning of fossil fuels, the cutting down of forests, and the overfarming of livestock. Then the causal question is, how do these factors cause Y, with Y being global warming? So we go to studies done by climate scientists. They tell us that the causal mechanism has to do with concentrations of harmful greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Yet climate scientists seek a deeper causal explanation. They want to know the chemistry of how fossil fuels create greenhouse gases and the chemistry underlying how greenhouse gases create global warming. The reality of science is that the discovery of a causal mechanism or mechanisms do not happen at once. Often pieces of the puzzle emerge over many studies, and you never know whether another causal piece will appear in the future. So theory building is usually a long process. In sociology and in many other disciplines, identifying an underlying causal mechanism is also the domain of theory, precisely because theory is an attempt to explain what is really happening. Once again, I want to strongly emphasize what I believe is a strongly powerful approach, and that is an objective mode of analysis, precisely because there are often surprises in the analysis of data. Those patterns that are not explained completely by existing theory. Again, a theoretical framework must never dictate. You can say that a theoretical framework is like a framework made of strong aluminum. It's bendable and flexible aluminum. Okay, another example of where the researcher strives to identify and understand the underlying causal mechanism that explains how X variable affects the outcome Y. For example, among female college students who report an early interest in STEM careers, their interest in such careers diminish as they experience their initial STEM college courses. Now, we don't merely want to know the immediate factors involved. Rather, we want to figure out how and the why their interest diminishes as they experience their initial STEM college courses. We want to understand the cultural and institutional mechanisms involved. We want to know, we want to go from the micro to the macro. So we want to know whether what is happening here is also happening in colleges and universities throughout the country. And for that, we need social theory. Such a study would entail the following 6 dimensions. 1 and 2 together, a theory-guided qualitative design. 3, well-defined research questions. 4, methods could include a number of data collection strategies and receptivity to abductive analyses. 5, a theoretical framework. And 6, the study ends with a theoretical argument. In the abductive mode of analysis, the researcher selects certain theories and constructs a theoretical framework to guide research design, data collection, and analyses. During the analysis phase, they use empirical findings and surprises to interrogate existing theory. The initial theoretical framework is like having a team of expert detectives, each following the same theoretical map, yet open to new discoveries and surprises. In some cases, patterns in the data reflect existing theory, but in other cases, patterns call for an alteration of theory. When patterns don't reflect existing theory, or when patterns suggest an alteration of existing theory, that's always good news. The researcher is always receptive when patterns don't fit theory. Therefore, the researcher follows an iterative process, always ready to refine the theoretical framework over and over again until it can plausibly explain observed patterns of action. In the abductive mode of analysis, there exists the potential for innovation in theory. Since all social theories are somewhat along a spectrum or path of maturity, theory building is always a possibility. Abductive analysis is where the researcher truly gets to apply the creative muscles. Theory and theoretical frameworks guide analysis rather than dictate it. It can lead to argued alterations or an expansion of existing theory. And even more importantly, creative theorizing of the phenomena under study. Okay, to put everything into perspective, our empirical findings are the result of our analysis of data, but we want to accurately interpret what we found. And that's where alterations in our theoretical framework come in. We want to go from the micro, the particular setting we study, to the macro, to what is happening in other similar contexts. We want to generalize as much as possible. In Mario Small's study of mothers in child care centers, he had to make alterations in Nanlin's theory of social capital in order to show what was really happening among the women in his study. The next 3 approaches are typically associated with quantitative methodologies rather than initial research questions. The study is driven by hypotheses and a deductive mode of analysis. Again, let's go through the 6 dimensions involved in a study using a deductive mode of analysis. 1, a deductive research design. 2, a quantitative methodology. 3, use of hypotheses. 4, statistical methods. 5, no theoretical framework. And 6, an empirical argument with conjectural theorizing. In the first of these approaches, the researcher wants to test whether a certain independent variable or variables have an effect on or predicts an outcome variable or a dependent variable. By effect, I mean exploring an association between variables. Here, the researcher develops hypotheses and employs a deductive design. Now, there is a motive behind why the researcher wants to look at these variables. For example, there is a controversy within the school system about whether a high level of bilingualism has a positive effect on grades and educational expectations. Some say yes and some say no. So there is a motive here. At this point, there is no theory or theoretical framework that is propelling the study. Simply establishing a positive association or a negative association or no association would be sufficient. Secondly, if the hypothesized association is supported, then the researcher makes an empirical argument. The researcher writes, quote, there is a positive association between bilingualism and school achievement. There are important policy implications that emerge from this study, end quote. The researcher wants to contemplate a potential causal effect given the existing literature. In any case, the researcher encourages future studies to engage in the development of theory that can account for the causal processes underlying the variables studied. In the next approach, the researcher identifies the problem to be studied and advances an existing theory that they believe can effectively analyze the data and illuminate the research problem. Again, let's look at the 6 dimensions of this approach. 1, a deductive research design. 2, a quantitative methodology. 3, use of hypotheses. 4, statistical methods. 5, a theoretical framework. There is a theoretical framework. And 6, a theoretical argument. In this approach, the researcher derives hypotheses from the theory and follows by collecting and analyzing data to see the extent to which the hypotheses are supported. In other words, the extent to which the existing theory was able to help explain the research problem. In writing up the study, the researcher puts forth a theoretical argument. Theory supported, theory not supported. The advantage here is that the existing theory shows its ability to illuminate a complex problem that otherwise could not be explained. The downside is that the validation of existing theory might take precedence, with the data being manipulated to fit the theory. In my mind, this is an ethical issue. And if the researcher is super invested in supporting a particular theory and ideology, well, the devil is there to tempt and seduce. The last approach, using an abductive mode of analysis, might attend to the potential risks entailed in the theory-driven approach just presented. Again, let's look at the 6 dimensions of this approach. 1, a deductive research design. 2, quantitative methodology. 3, use of hypotheses. 4, statistical methods. 5, a theoretical framework and receptivity to abductive analyses. And 6, a theoretical argument. In this approach, the researcher identifies the problem to be studied and is receptive to an abductive mode of analysis that begins with a selected and appropriate theoretical framework, but is ready to interrogate the framework based on an iterative analysis of data. Let me now sound a loud bell. In the case here, we are not using deductive reasoning or a deductive model. Remember, deductive analysis is black and white. A conclusion is either true or false and cannot be partly true and partly false. Here, we are open to an abductive mode of analysis. We have theory, but we are not strapped to theory. And we are not testing theory. Thus, similar to the previous approach, the researcher derives tentative hypotheses from a theory or initial theoretical framework and follows by collecting and analyzing data to see the extent to which the hypotheses are supported. In the case where the hypotheses are supported, the evidence may still suggest an enhancement of the theory, using whatever means necessary, whether it be insights by the researcher or outside theories and constructs. In the case where hypotheses are only partially supported and where there are surprises in the data, the researcher is committed to any necessary alterations in the theory, including entertaining outside theories and constructs that might help. The overarching goal in either case is not validation of the initial theory, but further theory building that will serve other researchers who investigate a similar phenomena. I recommend taking a look at a study by Philip Brandt and Stefan Timmermans for a good example of this abductive approach to quantitative research. Brandt and Timmermans argue that quantitative research shouldn't be viewed as a purely deductive process where researchers simply start with a fixed theory, generate hypotheses, and then either confirm or reject them with data. Instead, they argue that an abductive approach treats anomalies, unexpected statistical relationships, and surprising findings as opportunities for new theoretical insight. In other words, researchers remain open to revising their assumptions, rethinking their explanations, and even developing new theoretical ideas as they engage with the data. You'll find the Brandt and Timmermans study listed in the reference section of this video. Now let's look at real examples of three research approaches, seeing how the 6 dimensions play out in the planning and data analysis phases of a study, then in the formation of an argument. Let's start with the study that employs an inductive mode of analysis, and that doesn't rely on a theoretical framework. The task is to identify the factors that appear to be responsible for the outcome variable. Again, let's run down the 6 dimensions of this approach. 1, an inductive research design. 2, a qualitative methodology. 3, well-defined research questions. 4, even though this is mainly a qualitative methodology, the study relies on a number of data collection strategies. 5, no formal theoretical framework. 6, the study ends with an empirical argument. The example I provide here has to do with an investigation that searched for factors that appeared to contribute to a dramatic influx of Latino immigrants from Central America to the United States. Now, I take this example in part from the sociologist Greta Gripner, cited at the end of this PowerPoint. At the end of the study, this was a hot button topic in the media. All right, the researcher went into the field, observed, collected extensive data of different types, engaged in a rigorous analysis, and in time formed an empirical argument. Remember, the researcher's empirical argument is made up of 2 parts. 1, the patterns that emerge in their analysis of data. In other words, their findings. And second, their interpretation of their findings. Now, the researcher is ready to present her investigation in written form. In the context of the author's introduction, whether it be a journal article or a book, the author presents the standard statement of the problem and what's called the claim of significance. You can read with me. Quote, the recent influx of Latino immigrants from Central America to the United States has generated a great deal of media attention, particularly with regard to the current administration's emphasis on fortifying the southern border as the mainstay of its immigration policy. The author now addresses how the media and the government have erroneously portrayed this dramatic influx of immigrants. 1. Headlines often frame arrivals as an invasion, implying a sudden, criminal, and coordinated assault on the border. 2. Many of the migrants are criminals in their country of origin, or that they've been released from mental hospitals. 3. Asylum seekers are getting an easy or free ticket into the U.S. 4. Migrants unquestionably benefit from misinformation that the U.S. border is open. 5. Immigrants, especially undocumented, increase violent crime in the U.S. And 6. Migrants are a homogeneous group driven by the same single motive. All right, let's hit the brakes here. Although we can say that this study was inductive in design, she did not enter the field with a blank slate. She was very aware of dominant public narratives, media claims, and political explanations. So, while inductive in design, she entered the field with background assumptions, sensitizing ideas, and critical suspicions. Also, and quite important, because she was a good researcher, she knew of some of the complex economic problems in Central America. Frankly, I don't think it's possible in nearly all cases to enter the field with a blank slate. Researchers are trained to do their background research before entering the field. Furthermore, many researchers are experts in their field and often continue to pursue similar issues. Thus, while an inductive research design does not begin with formal theory or a theoretical framework, researchers do enter with background assumptions, sensitizing ideas, and critical suspicions. Anyway, this researcher collected and analyzed data of different types, including on economic development in Central America, in Central American countries, and on related social problems, and then interpreted her findings. Having done the research, she presented her empirical argument, focusing on the sequence of events that appear to motivate the migration north. You can follow me in the next slide. All right, let's see what she wrote. Quote, similar to what is occurring in other parts of the world, I argue that the current influx of migrants arose due to a sequence of events. Poor economic development in Central America, leading to widespread poverty. The rise of organized gangs engaged in various criminal activity, resulting in violence towards citizens who do not abide by gang rule. End quote. The researcher followed by stating, quote, the public is better served when the media addresses and dispels existing myths and through serious journalism and investigation informs the public about the real social forces that underlie migration, end quote. She also states that the media must also report on how the U.S.'s historical foreign policy in the region has played a role in the eventual influx of migrants and of immigrants, end quote. Note here that what makes the author's argument a bona fide argument because the researcher is making an assertion about a reality that is not well understood. And the assertion, intended to illuminate reality, is backed by evidence. Furthermore, the researcher makes an evidence-based assertion that challenges the validity of another claim. There exists in the public realm prejudices and erroneous beliefs about who the migrants are and why they flee north. And she refutes or argues against these myths with empirical data. Note as well that the researcher combines her empirical argument with what's called a normative argument. The author tells the reader what should be done about an important issue. Quote, the media and the government, when reporting on controversial issues, have a responsibility to dispel existing myths and to educate the public using substantiated investigative research, end quote. In the next example, researchers begin with empirical findings reported by other researchers. Among female college students who report an early interest in STEM careers, their interest in such careers diminish as they experience their initial STEM college courses, end quote. So the researchers ask, hey, what's going on? This study is best described as deductive in research design, inductive in analytical orientation, and empirical in its final argument. Why? Because the researchers began with predefined possible explanations. For data collection, they used academic records, structured interviews, and survey, but they did not begin with formal hypotheses derived from a theory. And finally, they remained open to what the data revealed. The study sought to explore the factors that appear to be responsible for the outcome. The researchers believe that if they were able to identify key factors, then a future research study could follow a theory-based causal analysis. For now, their goal was to form an empirical argument based on their findings. So again, let's run down the 6 dimensions of this approach. 1, an inductive research design. 2, a qualitative mixed methods study. 3, well-defined research questions. 4, methods include a number of data collection strategies. 5, no formal theoretical framework. And 6, the study ends with an empirical argument. So let's check it out. What happened that led these young women's decline of interest in pursuing a STEM career? Some college administrators claim that it could be the students' poor academic proficiency in math and science. The researchers wanted to investigate this as well as look at other potential factors. The researchers looked at a number of important variables or possible factors. Included were academic proficiency in math and science. 2, social interactions with male and female classmates. And 3, evaluation of their relationship with the professor or instructor. In the course of the study, the researchers found that among the women who showed interest in pursuing a STEM degree, those who reported gender bias in the classroom were less likely to take the courses needed to complete the degree. However, a complete and clear argument should address the nature of this gender bias and how this gender bias affects students' interest in pursuing a STEM degree. So let's see how these researchers turn their findings into a bona fide argument. You can follow me on the screen. Quote, we argue that many female college students that begin college with a moderate to high degree of interest in pursuing a STEM career lose such interest after their initial STEM courses. The evidence shows that this has nothing to do with differences in academic proficiency in math or science. Rather, the decrease in interest is due to women's experience with distressing sexual harassment and other forms of gender bias by their male classmates and by their male instructors. End quote. Again, why is this an argument? As shown a moment ago, the researchers are making an assertion about a reality that is not well understood, and the assertion intended to illuminate reality is backed by evidence. Furthermore, the researchers make an evidence-based assertion that challenges the validity of another claim. Some college administrators claim that the loss of interest was due to poor academic proficiency in math and science. In the worst case scenario, these administrators might have believed that women are just not cut out for STEM majors or careers. In this study, the researchers dispel such prejudices with rigorous research. Let's now turn to a study that employs a deductive design with the use of hypotheses. Educational researchers report that there is a growing consensus among elementary school teachers that among the Latino student population, among this group, highly bilingual students surpass English-only students across a number of academic indicators. However, a sizable segment of the public is suspicious of the claim that bilingualism has any academic or intellectual benefit. So, a study asks the question, when compared to English-dominant Latino students in elementary school, does having a high level of bilingualism affect students' experience in school? The intent of the researchers is to test and possibly establish a statistical relationship between measures of bilingualism and school achievement as measured by GPA. The hypotheses look like this. Hypothesis 1, and I quote, among working-class Latinx high school students, those who report a high level of bilingualism will report higher grades and higher educational expectations. Hypothesis 2, the relationship between bilingualism and achievement and expectations will be most significant when highly bilingual students are compared to those who are either English dominant or English only. In this example, while prior empirical research justified the hypotheses, no established theory was used in this study. Let's look at how the researchers convey first the main finding of the study and then their empirical argument. All right, the finding, and quote, we show here that among working class Latinx high school students, those who exhibit a high level of bilingualism report higher grades and higher educational expectations. This relationship is most significant when highly bilingual students are compared to those who are either English dominant or English only, period, quote, end quote. Now the empirical argument, quote, we argue here that based on our findings, possessing a high level of bilingualism carries with it a propensity for high achievement in school. Why this is so deserves more investigation. However, our findings suggest that there is something that is beneficial that comes with a high degree of bilingualism. This might have to do with generational status or psycholinguistic and cognitive processes, end quote. We also see a normative argument grounded in the study's findings. And so they write, quote, these findings can and should inform policy debates around bilingual education and about whether bilingualism can be viewed as a form of cultural wealth. Apart from the policy arena, these issues of pedagogy need to be addressed in teacher preparation programs, end quote. Again, to explain why bilingualism affects educational achievement, you would need a well-developed theoretical framework that would theorize the causal mechanism underlying the relationship between these two variables. Such a framework might draw from a number of fields like psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, cognitive psychology, and cultural anthropology. In our final example, let's look at a fictional study that's guided by a theoretical framework, but that is receptive to an abductive mode of analysis. But before we do this, let's do a very short review of how a theoretical framework helps you prepare for data collection and for your analysis of data. All right, your theoretical framework helps to identify what is important to look at, to sensitize you to certain processes or relationships, to provide you with concepts, constructs, and theories for interpreting findings, to provide you with an opportunity to contribute new theoretical ideas and to think about necessary adjustments to theory, a new way of thinking about a phenomena in question, and to situate results within a broader literature. Now, for any researcher who chooses to employ an abductive mode of analysis, what are the essentials? The researcher uses theory to guide and sensitize them, but the theory does not dictate. Theory is used iteratively. Initially, it informs observation. The researcher is alert to how theory illuminates, but is vigilant to how the data analysis often produces surprises or puzzles. Theory is dynamic and in a process of maturity. It's responsive to specific contexts. The researcher is always prepared to revise, extend, or reconfigure theory. Now for the final example. In the study presented here, two researchers sought to advance the study of how the social networks of working class students in high school can reveal a new and distinctive understanding of how social class operates among the working class high school population, and in particular among working class Latino students. The study's literature review incorporated several strands in the research literature. The researchers summarized studies on adults which show how opportunities for establishing social ties with people who either possess or control valued institutional resources are largely determined by social class background. Advantages include brokered occupational mobility, access to professional services, and bureaucratic influence. Thus, middle and upper middle class adults gain more institutional resources through their advantageous social networks. The accepted theoretical construct for such resources is social capital. Other researchers in the field, buoyed by this research on adults, sought to understand how schools serving working class populations often operated in ways that privilege only some students with ample opportunities to form supportive ties with school-based institutional agents. These studies revealed that among working class Latino English proficient high school students, those with the highest grades appear to enjoy the closest and most supportive relationships with school personnel. You can say that this is an ethical issue, perhaps even a moral one, since students who are having a difficult time with the subject or with some life stressor also need help. Such students may also feel socially marginal within the school, and close and supportive ties to teachers and a counselor could help a lot. Anyway, the researchers' quest was to uncover why and how these close relationships form from a more theoretical perspective, that is, between school personnel and high achievers. What relational and attraction processes are activated, and what institutional or organizational structures are operating to sustain these processes. In the example here, the researchers rely on theories of social and cultural capital to guide the study. Drawing from the research on adults, theories of social capital heighten attention to how resources, opportunities, and advantages flow through social networks and through social relationships. In the study here, researchers are keenly interested in those relational processes that activate and sustain supportive ties. They saw that theories of social capital point to shared interests and shared social identities and the development of interpersonal trust. However, because they were interested in exploring the role of social class and race in activating social capital, they drew on the theory of cultural capital developed by Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital is about how dominant group members signal to each other about who is an insider and who is an outsider. And they do this through cultural and social linguistic cues. Being identified as an insider comes with privileges, opportunities, and shared resources. In the study here, the issue is how might high-achieving students be unknowingly eliciting a form of cultural and linguistic capital that teachers and school personnel find unconsciously attractive. The researchers examined their data according to Bourdieu's theory. Thus, guided by his theory, teachers and school personnel did seem to interpret students' grades as valid indicators of authentic talent, intelligence, and or merit. Grades are seen by teachers as indicators that students relative to those with lower grades are most motivated and invested in assimilating middle-class white cultural dispositions and conforming to institutional standards of success. Employing Bourdieu's theoretical assertions and based on their field data, for many teachers and counselors, their interpretation of grades did seem pro-assimilation and largely unconscious. Also, high-achieving students used language in a certain way and communicated aspirations in ways that was noticed by school personnel. And finally, among these educators, their judgments of meritocracy did appear to be understood as valid and objective, ideologically neutral, and largely taken for granted. The researchers' data also showed that school tracking functioned to engineer advantageous relationships between school personnel and high achievers, while preventing low-achieving students from benefiting from such resource-rich relations. Still guided by their theoretical framework, researchers continued with an iterative analysis of their data. They were alert to opportunities that come with an abductive mode of analysis. They understood that theories are dynamic, responsive to distinct contexts, and not always attentive to instances that are contrary to a theory's predictions. Thus, these researchers were prepared to question Bourdieu's theory and to revise or extend the theory when their analysis of data saw it as necessary. Ultimately, while they viewed Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital as providing them with lots of insight, they viewed that the theory overemphasizes structural constraints, leaving teachers and counselors looking passive and devoid of resistance and critical consciousness. Their data showed that there were some teachers and school personnel in their study who resisted the idea that school achievement could only happen through students' conformity to white mainstream standards of success. They saw that some teachers and counselors had an expansive and multicultural view of talent, intelligence, and cultural competence. Theoretically, the researchers saw that Bourdieu as not sufficiently attentive to teachers' capacity for reflective, creative, or transformative action. Some teachers and other personnel consciously acted as empowerment agents, cultivating students' agency and critical awareness of the various social forces they encounter daily. They wanted students to know that there existed other cultural strategies for academic achievement, but without accommodating to mainstream myths of meritocracy and assimilation. They professed to students that access to system knowledge was critical to their success in the educational system and beyond, and that structural constraints and unenlightened gatekeepers would greet them at a return, but that they had the capacity to act strategically as an agent of social change and with the vision of a more authentic democracy. At this point, I want to introduce two concepts that I believe can be incredibly useful when writing an argument-driven manuscript, and they are preface argument and production argument. I began this tutorial by suggesting that there's a growing understanding within the social sciences that argument-driven manuscripts are often the most effective and efficient way to present research. Why? Because the reader, including journal editors, can quickly understand what you investigated, why it matters, and what you ultimately intend to argue based on your findings. Readers do not have to wait until the final stages of your article or your book to figure out what your central argument actually is. And frankly, revealing your argument early can also hook the reader. There's something deeply engaging about watching someone make a serious argument and defend it with evidence. The reader may think, all right, let me see if you can persuade me. What I'm suggesting here is that there are advantages. However, you need to check with the journal that you're considering to see what the norm is. You can also write to the journal editor. Now, let me make it very clear, a preface argument is an option, not an absolute necessity. Now, before going further, let me clarify the terms argument and thesis because they're often used interchangeably. Many of you remember from your first year writing courses that a thesis statement is often defined as the central claim of a paper, the upfront sentence that tells the reader what the writer is arguing and why it matters. However, your actual defense of your thesis developed in the course of your research. Your defense was your argument, what I call your production argument. Just like the prosecuting attorney in the courtroom analogy presented earlier, you sought to better understand a complex problem. You did the research. You came to some understanding of the problem. But ultimately, without 100% certainty, you had to come up to some conclusion, some final analysis. Then, when you began writing, you introduced this conclusion to the reader through a thesis statement. Then you went on to defend your analysis in the course of your paper. Again, your defense was your production argument. In our courtroom analogy, rather than saying that the prosecuting attorney presents her thesis to the jury, we say she presents her argument. She presents her argument in concise form. Then in the ensuing days, she presents the argument again, but in elaborated form, intertwined with substantial evidence. Now, in academic research, we can also follow the model of the trial courtroom, but with some modification. First, your manuscript typically begins by introducing a problem or complex issue you investigated. You present what writing experts call your claim of significance, why the issue deserves scholarly attention. Now comes your theoretical framework, and this is where you show readers what prior scholarship exists, what theories guided your analysis, and why those theories were necessary. This is also the place that you provide the theoretical jargon that will allow the reader to understand your analysis and your argument. Now, similar to the prosecuting attorney in the courtroom analogy, you present your upfront argument. But in the case here, you can now use the necessary jargon, what I call your preface argument. You tell the reader, quote, based on my analysis of data and guided by the theoretical framework presented here, I argue, etc., etc. Again, similar to the prosecuting attorney, you go on to your analysis of findings and an elaboration of your argument, what I call your production argument. It's important to know that in many published studies guided by a theoretical framework, there's no preface argument. In these cases, the reader eventually identifies the production argument in the course of the analyses and culminating in the last quarter of the article. As I stated in the beginning of this tutorial, various writing experts in academia, me included, are asserting that having what I call a preface argument has many benefits. Your manuscript becomes argument-driven. You can see in diagram 1 presented here how I lay out the essential parts of an academic argument. What I want you to notice here is that your thesis, or what I call your preface argument, gives the reader an early understanding of your central claim. Your production argument then unfolds in the analysis section of your manuscript, where you persuade the reader through evidence, your insightful interpretation and careful reasoning. In other words, this is where your argument is fully developed and defended. You'll see here that I've inserted the role of your theoretical framework, which ultimately leads to your preface argument. This diagram helps us see something very important. Your theoretical framework helps generate the concepts, the language, and analytical lens that make your preface argument possible. And then in the analysis section, your production argument shows reader exactly how you arrived at your final interpretation. This is why a strong theoretical framework and strong argument are so deeply connected. All right, let's now review the research approach that relies on a well-developed theory or theories presented through a theoretical framework, and where the final manuscript is argument-driven. In this section, we'll see how a theoretical framework moves through various stages of life. It begins with its emergence in your literature review before you collect data in the field. Then it moves into your behind-the-scenes organization and analysis of field data or computer-based data. It then gives you the language needed to articulate your preface argument. And finally, it helps you substantiate your production argument. And there is one final stage, perhaps the most transformative one. That is the period when your work begins to be cited by other scholars. And your theoretical framework begins to guide their research. That's when your ideas begin to take on a life beyond your own study. The initial stage begins with the birth of your original questions about a phenomenon. Sometimes that birth emerges from curiosity. Sometimes it emerges from frustration, even moral outrage. Sometimes it emerges from your own lived experience, and sometimes it comes with early theoretical insights or intuitions. That was certainly true in my own case during graduate school. Then comes the second stage, which is a review of the empirical and theoretical literature at the beginning of your study. Of course, this first life of the theoretical framework is easy for doctoral students to recognize because their literature review must often be extensive and is carefully scrutinized by their dissertation committee. But this is also true when scholars begin to write grant proposals. More importantly, whether your study is qualitative, a case study, or quantitative, successful research requires a rigorous literature review. For established scholars, engagement with the literature often continues for years, both at the beginning of a project and while they're actively conducting research in the field. From that literature review, you begin selecting the theory or theories you believe will best support your investigation. These theories help you pursue the phenomena and issues you care about. And importantly, the way you understand those issues often becomes more refined through both the theories you read and the empirical studies that help sharpen your research questions. Now we're at the third stage. From your literature review and from the theories you identify as most relevant, you gradually begin constructing the theoretical framework that will guide your study. But remember that framework often continues to mature right up until the moment you begin writing your manuscript. For most scholars drawing from theory, the theoretical house they build becomes an integration of empirical studies, the theoretical literature, and the major conceptual ideas. For example, social capital theory or structural theories of organizations. Some scholars may also draw from grand theories in order to situate their work within a broader epistemological tradition, particularly traditions concerned with power and ideology. For example, a study may rely on Marxism to examine urban planning. Another may draw from critical race theory to study undocumented families. Your theoretical framework, or what I sometimes call your theoretical house, often draws not only from major theories, but also from useful constructs and from theoretical ideas from multiple sources. For example, you may want to use the construct of empowerment agent, but not necessarily use social capital theory as a primary engine of your study. You may instead draw from empowerment theory in the critical social work literature. Your framework may pull together multiple constructs from different literatures, while still being broadly oriented by critical race theory or radical feminist theories of social reproduction. You may also use the construct, as an example, the construct of self-efficacy without fully relying on Albert Bandura's social learning theory. And sometimes scholars borrow ideas from empirical studies because those ideas carry significant theoretical value. But no matter where you borrow ideas from, always cite carefully and give proper credit to the originators. Your theoretical framework is not a static object sitting on a shelf. It's everything you need to construct a house: lumber, nails, and concrete. And once constructed, it affords you insight. It becomes a protective space for contemplation and creative thinking, an analytical lens, and it is here that your framework begins doing some of its most important work. The next stage is the analysis of your data and the interpretation of your findings. Your theoretical framework provides both you and eventually your reader with the concepts, constructs, and theoretical vocabulary needed to interpret your findings in an insightful way. Not only are you contributing to people's understanding of the phenomena you investigated, your theoretical framework may also allow you to contribute to ongoing theory building in your field. That's a very exciting possibility. Ultimately, your theoretical framework enables you to make a persuasive theoretical argument throughout the analysis of data, while highlighting the new knowledge your study has produced. And ultimately, it's your argument-driven manuscript that leaves the reader with a deeper sense of insight. Finally, your theoretical framework helps you discuss the broader generalizability of your findings and the wider relevance of your theoretical argument. The fifth stage begins when you finally sit down to write your dissertation, your journal article, or your book. We can also say that this stage represents the second life of your literature review. It is through your written literature review that you now reconstruct your theoretical framework for the reader. Just as a writer of fiction writes with an awareness of creating a scene in the reader's mind, so too does the academic writer. Let me emphasize something very important here. The focus of your literature review should be the literature that helps you construct your theoretical framework for the reader. For those writing a journal manuscript, your goal is not to show the reader how comprehensive your literature review was. This is especially important when writing for journals because, as you know, you are writing within strict word limits. The same goes for your methods section. Now, for doctoral students writing dissertations, your literature review will likely be longer. In that case, turn to your committee chair for guidance. Now let's address the steps in constructing your theoretical framework. Now you reconstruct your theoretical framework based on your understanding on that particular day, not based on how you understood it 3 months earlier. What do I mean by that? New insights and revisions often emerge while you're writing. You may write something at 10 in the morning and then wake up at 2 the next morning. You rush to your computer and suddenly add a sentence that makes your framework much stronger. That happens more often than people admit. So as you reconstruct your theoretical framework, always think about the reader as they follow your thinking and your writing. Use your imagination. How are they feeling as you present the literature, the theories you selected, and the framework you are carefully building? You are not only being kind to the reader, you're also creating an experience of discovery and insight. You want to hook them. You want to keep them intellectually engaged. You want your research to positively influence their own scholarship. There have been many times when, as a reviewer of a journal manuscript or as an editor, I've had to read a paragraph 2 or 3 times. Why? Often because the sentences were too long or because the grammar was unclear. Remember, besides being a scholar, you are also a writer. You are an author. That means paying attention to sentence length, tone, voice, punctuation, and avoiding unnecessary wordiness. Be kind to the reader. Your goal is not to impress people with complexity. Your goal is to keep readers from putting your article or your book down in frustration. You want them to download your article, buy your book, recommend your work, and perhaps even cite your scholarship in their own writing. The theoretical framework you present early in your manuscript prepares the reader for the preface argument and for the analysis of your data that follows. Here's the key point. Your preface argument only makes sense to the reader because they have first read and understood your written theoretical framework. Let me leave you with one final analogy. Imagine a new lighthouse keeper, excited and perhaps a little anxious, ready to turn on a brand new beacon that will guide ships safely through the night. But first, the lighthouse itself must be built. The structure must be stable. The rooms must be equipped. everything must be in place. Only then can the great lamp be turned on. Your theoretical framework is your lighthouse on the hill. You constructed it. The rationale for the theories have been introduced. The necessary social constructs are all in place. Then the lamp goes on, which is your preface argument. Now the reader can follow you. Before I end, I want to emphasize something very important. Your preface argument and your production argument often crystallized at the very end of your research study, and especially through the writing and revision of your manuscript. Think of a playwright at his or her desk. A story evolves in the playwright's mind. The story takes time to mature. It takes different turns. It is through the writing process that the playwright's imagination gradually transfers to text on the page. And so it is with you. At first, what you have is a working argument. This working argument remains flexible, malleable, and open to revision as you continue analyzing your data and writing your dissertation, your article, or book manuscript. Your mind is working hard. Your argument is unfolding. Sometimes while you're writing at your desk, sometimes while jogging in the park, and sometimes even while you're asleep. Your argument reaches its final form when you complete the final revision of your paper or manuscript. Indeed, it is often the case that the preface argument is revised and polished just when the scholar is finishing the writing of their manuscript. We might think about this process the way a theater director works with the playwright and cast members. With the cast members to create the experience of a real or imagined event for a live audience. A great deal happens behind the scenes. There are rehearsals, revisions, alterations, and then more rehearsals, all paving the way for opening night. The challenge for everyone involved in the production is to convey a coherent and meaningful sense of drama. The goal is for the audience to fully understand the major theme of the production. Everyone involved must be ready by the time the curtain opens. And if you think about it, when you look at the references at the end of a scholarly paper, you can see that many scholars were involved, almost like cast members, all helping to shape your final argument. By final argument, I'm referring to both your preface argument and your production argument. But the true grand finale comes with the publication of your manuscript and with the benefit experienced by those scholars who read your work, build on it, and cite it in their own research. Well, that's it. I truly hope you have found this tutorial helpful. And if you stayed with me from beginning to end, congratulations. You've made a serious investment in your development as a scholar. Before closing, let me say this. Any errors or inaccuracies in this tutorial are entirely my own. I've done my very best to present material that is accurate and reflective of the research, design, and methodology literature. But this tutorial is only one small part of your ongoing training in research methodology. Scholars by nature bring a critical eye to all knowledge claims, including claims made in the area of research design and methodology. Verification, critique, and continued learning are part of the scholarly process. In the final slides, you'll see the works I cited throughout this PowerPoint presentation. Feel free to take a screenshot if you like. You'll also see my website address as well. And as with the previous videos, in the last slides, you can see all the topics I've covered in this series. And finally, I wish you the very best in your scholarly writing. May you have a long, prosperous, and deeply fulfilling career as a scholar, academic, and researcher. And may your work contribute knowledge that is lasting and meaningful to the world.